I've completed 10 portrait sessions on the Fujifilm XT5 over the last 2 months of ownership, and I'm confident to answer the question of, is the Fujifilm XT5 with its 40 megapixel APS-C sensor any good for portrait photography? Or do you need that full frame look for portraits? So this is my experience coming from full frame to APS-C for my portraiture work. Let's jump in. The first and arguably the most important part of a camera's performance for portrait photography is how the RAW files edit to achieve those pleasant skin tones. And APS-C cameras have a disadvantage with their smaller sensors, which does result in less dynamic range and color depth. However, Fujifilm have combated these two disadvantages with a 40 megapixel X-Trans sensor and the option of DR settings. I've been using the DR200 setting, which blends a lower ISO with a higher ISO image, which does result in a bump of dynamic range and color depth in the RAW files. So along with the 40 megapixel sensor and how unique that X-Trans sensor layout is, the RAW files edit beautifully, and for portraits I have no issues compared to Canon or Sony full frame RAW files. And if we even compare the RAW files of the XT5 next to my full frame Sony a7 IV, I doubt you'll be able to tell the difference. And if you do like how I edit my portrait images, make sure you go check out my Lightroom presets, which are linked in the description down below. The autofocus of the XT5 is not great, and something I'm struggling with the most as I'm consistently missing focus. But for portraits, the autofocus actually works fantastic. I think this is because of the user experience of the XT5's autofocus is pretty poor, and basically the different focus modes and focus zones are just not great, as you think you have focus on a subject only to find out that you're focused on the background. But for portraits, the subject is very clear and easy for the XT5 to identify where the focus is with the eye and face tracking. I do use the wide setting in continuous autofocus, which is the same setting I use for any other camera. So I have no complaints at all for the autofocus when using the XT5 for portrait photography. But the focus and the performance does really depend on what lens you use. Fujifilm have a mixed bag of lenses, and it's pretty amazing how much fluctuation and difference in performance these lenses all have. Some are decent while others are pretty bad to say the least, and I'm seriously spoiled coming from Sony's selection along with their third-party glass. So these are the lenses that I've found work the best from some trial and error. Firstly is the Fujifilm 18mm f1.4. Now this lens is great, it's sharp, and the autofocus works as good as you're going to get on a Fujifilm camera. 28mm full frame field of view is a great focal length for portraits, as it sits between two of my most used focal lengths for portraits, the 24 and 35mm. So 28mm is like killing two birds with one stone. The next lens I've been using with amazing results is the Viltrox 27mm f1.2. Now this is a 40mm full frame field of view, and if you are subscribed, you'll know that this is a focal length that I resonate a lot with. This lens is sharp with great autofocus, but it's a little bit too big, more like a full frame prime lens. So while I do love this lens, I would recommend the Fujifilm 33mm f1.4 if you have the budget for it. The 33mm from Fuji gives you the popular 50mm full frame field of view and pairs perfectly with the 18mm. 2850 is a great combination of focal lengths for portraits, and I think I'll be selling the Viltrox for that 33mm, so make sure you subscribe to find out why. Lastly is a lens I got to test out last week, and that's the super popular 90mm f2. This gives you a 135mm full frame equivalent, and I personally don't use 135mm for portraits, but I do use 135mm for wedding ceremonies and receptions. Now, I know this lens is super popular, but I just do not rate it, as it's a little bit soft and the autofocus is not amazing. This is expected and typical from longer focal lengths. The render of color is completely different from other Fuji lenses, making the editing process annoying as you're constantly juggling your raw white balance. It's also very large for an f2 APS-C prime lens, so I'm probably upsetting a few people as this lens has a cult-like following, but that's my own and honest opinion. So in short, I think the 18mm and the 33mm is a perfect portrait setup. And if you watched last week's video, you'll know why I don't recommend zoom lenses like the Fujifilm 16-55 f2.8 for portraits. So in relation to lenses, the only disadvantage that I can think of for the Fujifilm XT5 for portrait photography is the reduction in shallow depth of field you get from APS-C sensors. So if you have an APS-C lens with an aperture of f1.4, the depth you get is about f2 full frame. To be clear, your exposure doesn't change, so f1.4 APS-C is f1.4 full frame, medium format, large format, etc, etc. You only get less shallow depth of field, or the out of focus background is reduced. Now for me, this is not an issue at all, as I actually think f1.4 on my full frame cameras is too much, and as a result I do shoot around f2 95% of the time on my full frame Sony a7 IV. And if I want to get more depth with a APS-C camera, I'll just bring the subject away from the background or shoot on longer focal lengths, which results in more shallow depth of field. These two techniques result in more depth, but I do like environmental portraits to get the background visible and show the sense of space or the scene within the portrait image. And that's why I'm not a massive fan of lenses longer than 50mm. I'm also not planning on using Fujifilm for weddings because of their unreliable autofocus. It works great for a single subject, but when you have multiple subject or faces like a confetti exit, I just don't trust it. Also, the Fujifilm lenses are okay, but they're no Sony or Sigma full frame lens. These are all super consistent across the board. So in a nutshell, is the Fujifilm XT5 good for portraits? Well, definitely 100%. As these fun test shoots, I'm always picking up this XT5 over my full frame Sony bodies and lenses, and having those film simulations in the live view is great, as it's super insightful to see how the final edit will look like. And that's because I've been using the Astra Soft or the Classic Chrome, which looks very similar to my film presets. So if you do want to emulate this look, then make sure you shoot RAW and check out my Lightroom presets, linked down in the description below. And you'll get 25% off when you sign up to my photography breakdown newsletter. And if you like this video, you know what to do, and make sure you subscribe for more great photography content. All right guys, that's all, and we'll see you next week. Let's go.